Flames rise in the town square as leather-bound pages curl into blackened ash. The year is 1235, and the Church has declared its verdict on forbidden knowledge. One by one, books tumble into the pyre, centuries of wisdom vanishing in the smoke, entire worlds of thought erased with a single decree. This wasn't just paper burning. It was the silencing of voices, the murder of ideas. For over 600 years, the medieval Church systematically destroyed texts that challenged its authority. Pagan philosophies, alternative Christian Gospels, scientific discoveries, even women's writings. Whole libraries reduced to cinders. Today we ask the haunting question: what priceless knowledge was lost to those fires forever? What startling truths about our world, our history, even our own humanity, were stolen from us by the flames? The answers will shock you, because this isn't just about ancient books. It's about the deliberate rewriting of human understanding. Stay with us as we uncover the forbidden manuscripts that dared to tell different stories and paid the ultimate price. By the end of this journey, you'll never look at history the same way again. Now let's step back to truly grasp the staggering scale of this intellectual massacre. This wasn't just a few scattered bonfires, it was a continent-wide campaign of annihilation. From the bustling markets of Paris to the quiet monasteries of Bavaria, no corner of Europe escaped the flames. Church authorities didn't just target a handful of controversial texts. They waged war against entire categories of human thought, methodically hunting down books in every form they existed. Precious illuminated manuscripts in cathedral libraries, practical medical treatises in private homes, even folk remedies scratched onto scraps of parchment by village healers. Consider the numbers that survive in church records alone. In the Spanish city of Cordoba, over 80,000 Arabic scientific texts, some of the most advanced medical and astronomical knowledge of the age, were torched in a single day. The Library of Alexandria comparisons don't do justice to what happened here, because unlike that famous ancient burning, this destruction was intentional, systematic, and celebrated as holy work. Monks who'd spent their lives copying pagan philosophers were suddenly ordered to burn their own scriptoriums. Kings who once collected heretical poetry now presided over their public destruction. The methods were chillingly efficient. First came the decrees, papal bulls like Pope Gregory IX's Excommunicamus in 1231, which commanded bishops to root out pernicious books from every diocese. Then came the raids, often timed to religious festivals when crowds could witness the spectacle. In Toulouse, Dominican friars would parade through streets with armfuls of confiscated manuscripts before tossing them into pre-built pyres, turning knowledge into a public spectacle of orthodoxy. Private libraries weren't safe either. A single anonymous accusation could send armed clerics rifling through a scholar's home, seizing anything from geometry textbooks to love poetry if the wording seemed suspicious. What made this especially devastating was how targeted the destruction became. Certain knowledge was marked for total erasure. Take the Cathars of southern France. Not only were their believers burned alive, but every single one of their beautifully illustrated dualist scriptures was hunted down and destroyed. Today we only know fragments of their beliefs from the angry refutations written by their persecutors. The same happened to Germanic pagan lore, Slavic folk medicine, even early Christian texts now considered heresies, like the Montanist prophecies that once rivaled the Book of Revelation. This wasn't random censorship, it was the surgical removal of competing worldviews. Perhaps most tragically, the burnings created gaps in human understanding we'll never fill. When Archbishop Diego de Landa burned the Mayan codices in the New World centuries later, he famously lamented that among them were works of great genius. How many similar admissions were never made about the European knowledge lost? We know, for instance, that nearly all pre-Christian Celtic astronomy texts perished, their sophisticated star maps dismissed as Druid superstition. Byzantine physicians wrote of miracle cures recorded in now vanished Egyptian papyri. Even practical knowledge disappeared, like Roman civil engineering techniques that might have spared medieval cities decades of flooding and collapse. This systematic purge didn't just remove books, it rewired European thought for centuries. Imagine a world where universities could have taught Aristotle alongside indigenous philosophies, where hospitals might have blended Christian prayer with Arabic anatomy charts. That alternate history went up in smoke, one carefully curated bonfire at a time. As we turn now to the first category of banned knowledge, the pre-Christian texts that threatened the new religious order, remember this chilling truth. What survives today is only the version of history the burners wanted us to have. Now we move forward to uncover the first major casualty of this great burning, the ancient wisdom that existed long before Christianity spread across Europe. The Church didn't just erase books that challenged its teachings, it waged war against entire worldviews that had thrived for centuries, ensuring that future generations would only know these traditions through the distorted lens of their conquerors. Consider the Sibylline books of Rome, one of the most famous losses. These weren't just any texts, they were sacred oracles consulted by emperors in times of crisis, believed to hold prophecies about Rome's destiny. Housed in the temple of Jupiter, they were so revered that priests guarded them with their lives. But when Christianity became Rome's state religion in the 4th century, these ancient scrolls were declared dangerous superstition. By the year 405, the last remaining copies had vanished, likely burned by zealous officials eager to erase any competition to biblical prophecy. Today, we only know fragments preserved in Christian authors' dismissive references like quoting an enemy's words to mock them, but Rome was just the beginning. Across Europe, indigenous belief systems met the same fate. The Celtic Druids, for example, left no written records of their own. Not because they lacked knowledge. Roman accounts described their sophisticated astronomy and herbal medicine, but because oral traditions died with them. When Christian missionaries cut down sacred groves and banned Druidic practices, centuries of star lore, poetry, and legal wisdom disappeared forever. Even seemingly harmless texts like Irish agricultural calendars marking seasonal festivals were destroyed for their pagan associations. Then there were the philosophical works that posed a different kind of threat. Pre-Christian thinkers like the Greek philosopher Porphyry had written detailed critiques of Christianity that forced early theologians to sharpen their arguments. By the Middle Ages, church leaders realized these opposing views couldn't just be debated, they had to be erased. Porphyry's 15-volume Against the Christians survived just long enough for church fathers like Augustine to condemn it before it vanished entirely. Only quotes preserved in refutations hint at its powerful arguments. Even more tragic were the losses from smaller cultures that left no defenders. The Baltic tribes, for instance, had rich oral histories and wooden carvings depicting their gods. When Teutonic knights Christianized the region, they methodically burned every shrine and sacred object. Today, scholars piece together their beliefs from enemy chronicles and scattered folklore, like trying to reconstruct a shattered mosaic with half the tiles missing. What makes this destruction especially haunting is how much we'll never know. The Sibylline books might have held alternative visions of Rome's past. Druidic astronomy could have offered unique insights into natural cycles, and indigenous philosophies might have given us entirely different ways to understand humanity's place in the world. Instead, we're left with gaping holes in history where entire ways of thinking were reduced to ashes. As we turn next to the suppressed Christian texts that even challenge the church from within, remember this: the burnings didn't just erase rivals. They shaped what we consider history itself. What remains is just one thread of a much richer tapestry, forever frayed by flames. But now, let's turn our attention to a different kind of forbidden knowledge, one that came not from outside the church but from within. Even as the flames consumed pagan texts, another group of writings faced the same fate despite bearing the name of Christ. These were the Gnostic Gospels, a collection of early Christian texts that dared to present a radically different portrait of Jesus and his teachings. Unlike the familiar New Testament, these writings offered mysteries, hidden wisdom, and a vision of spirituality that challenged the very foundations of the growing church. Take the Gospel of Thomas, for instance. Discovered in the sands of Egypt in the 20th century, this ancient text contains no stories of miracles or parables about the kingdom of heaven. Instead, it's a collection of secret sayings where Jesus speaks not as a savior but as a guide to inner enlightenment. One striking passage reads, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This isn't the Jesus of the established Gospels. It's a teacher of self-discovery, one who urges followers to look within rather than to an institutional church for salvation. Then there's the Gospel of Judas, a text so controversial that early church leaders condemned it as heresy before erasing it entirely. Lost for centuries, a single copy resurfaced in the 1970s, revealing a Judas unrecognizable from the betrayer of the New Testament. In this version, Judas isn't a villain but Jesus' most trusted disciple, the only one entrusted with sacred knowledge, and his betrayal, far from being treachery, is a divine act meant to fulfill prophecy. To church authorities, this was dangerous. If Judas wasn't evil, then the church's entire moral framework, built on concepts of sin and redemption, could unravel. Why were these texts so threatening? The answer lies in power. The early church wasn't just spreading a faith, it was building an institution with strict hierarchies, creeds, and controls. Gnostic teachings, by contrast, often dismissed the need for priests or sacraments. They claimed that salvation came through personal revelation, not church doctrine, and that every believer could access divine truth without intermediaries. Imagine a world where faith wasn't governed by bishops but by individual seekers, where authority came from within, not from Rome. To church leaders, this wasn't just wrong. It was an existential threat. By the 4th century, the battle lines were drawn. Bishops like Irenaeus of Lyons railed against the Gnostics, calling their texts an abyss of madness and a wicked art. When Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, the newly empowered church moved swiftly to standardize the faith. At the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, leaders defined official doctrine, and anything outside it became heresy. Gnostic writings, once read alongside the New Testament, were ordered destroyed. Monks scrubbed their parchment clean to reuse it. Scrolls were burned or buried. In a final irony, some of the only surviving copies were hidden by monks who couldn't bear to erase them completely, stashed in jars and buried in the Egyptian desert, where they waited 16 centuries to be found. What did we lose when these texts vanished? Not just alternate versions of familiar stories, but entire dimensions of early Christian thought. The Gnostics saw the material world as flawed, even illusory, and taught that the soul's journey was about awakening from this illusion. Their Jesus wasn't just a martyr but a revealer of cosmic secrets. Had these ideas survived, Christianity might have evolved into something far more mystical, less focused on sin and more on transcendence. And yet, the Church's victory wasn't absolute. Fragments persisted, quoted in condemnations, hidden in caves, even preserved by enemies. When archaeologists uncovered the Nag Hammadi library in 1945, they found 52 texts, including the Gospels of Thomas and Philip, untouched for millennia. It was as if a door had cracked open, giving us back a whisper of what was lost. As we move forward to explore the next chapter of this hidden history, remember, the books burned weren't just paper and ink. They were voices, worldviews, possibilities, and in silencing them, the Church didn't just shape religion, it shaped reality itself. Now, shifting our gaze beyond religious texts, we encounter a different kind of fire, one that consumed the very foundations of human knowledge. While the Church silenced rival spiritual voices, it also turned its flames toward the secular wisdom of antiquity. targeting the scientific achievements of Greek and Roman thinkers. These were works that dared to explain the natural world through reason rather than scripture, and for that they were deemed dangerous. Consider the fate of Hypatia, the renowned mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher of Alexandria. In the early 5th century, she stood as one of the last guardians of the great library's intellectual legacy, teaching students about geometry, astronomy, and the motions of the planets. Her crime, embracing knowledge that challenged the Church's geocentric view of the universe. The cosmos, as Hypatia taught, followed mathematical laws, not divine whims. This idea unsettled powerful bishops who saw her influence as a threat. In the year 415, a mob of Christian zealots, incited by the Patriarch Cyril, dragged her through the streets, murdering her with shattered pottery before burning her writings. With her death, entire treatises on conic sections, celestial mechanics, and advanced algebra vanished, leaving gaps in human understanding that would take centuries to fill. But Hypatia was not alone. Centuries earlier, the works of Democritus, who theorized that all matter was composed of tiny, indivisible atoms, were systematically suppressed. Church fathers like Augustine dismissed atomic theory as incompatible with the miracle of transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine literally became Christ's flesh and blood during communion. If matter was just empty space and particles, how could such a transformation be sacred? So Democritus' writings, which might have jump-started modern chemistry, were lost to the flames. Even the meticulous medical texts of Galen, the Roman physician whose anatomical studies dominated medicine for over 1,000 years, faced censorship. His dissections of human cadavers revealed truths about the body that contradicted biblical accounts of creation. Church authorities purged his more controversial works, leaving medieval doctors to rely on fragmented, often inaccurate copies. Meanwhile, the groundbreaking astronomy of Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed a heliocentric solar system 17 centuries before Copernicus, was erased entirely. His lone surviving mention comes from Archimedes, who wrote that Aristarchus' ideas were unthinkable to most of his contemporaries. By the Middle Ages, even that faint echo was gone. The tragedy here isn't just the loss of individual genius. It's the severing of an entire intellectual tradition. The ancient world had libraries like Alexandria, where scholars collaborated across disciplines, refining geometry, engineering, and medicine. But as Christianity rose, these institutions were dismantled. Theophilus, the bishop of Alexandria, ordered the destruction of the city's Serapeum temple in the year 391, along with its daughter library, a treasure trove of scientific scrolls. Witnesses described bonfires so vast they burned for days. What might humanity have achieved if these works survived? The atomic theory alone could have revolutionized science a millennium earlier. Heliocentrism might have spared Galileo his trial, and Hypatia's mathematics could have accelerated the Renaissance. Instead, Europe plunged into an age where questions about nature were often met with accusations of heresy. Yet whispers remained. Monks in isolated monasteries, Arab scholars in Baghdad, and Jewish translators in Spain preserved fragments of this knowledge, stitching them into new texts. When the Renaissance finally dawned, thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Kepler would rediscover these ideas, not as novelties but as echoes of a forgotten past. The fires couldn't erase everything, but one thing is certain: the cost of that suppression was incalculable. As we step forward into the next shadowed corner of history, we'll encounter another group whose voices the Church sought to extinguish, not scholars this time, but entire movements of believers who dared to interpret Christianity differently. The Cathars and their lost libraries await. Now, as the smoke of lost scientific wisdom still lingers in our minds, we turn to another chapter of erasure where entire movements of faith, not just books, were wiped from the earth. Among these, the Cathars stand as haunting figures, a community whose radical vision of Christianity threatened the Church so deeply that their very memory was sentenced to flames. The Cathars emerged in the 12th century, flourishing in the Languedoc region of southern France. They called themselves the Good Christians, but to the Church they were heretics of the worst kind. Why? Because their beliefs upended the foundations of medieval Catholicism. The Cathars rejected the idea of a single, all-powerful God, instead preaching a dualistic universe where light and darkness, spirit and matter were locked in eternal struggle. To them, the material world was not created by a benevolent God but was the work of a lesser, evil force, an idea that made the Church's sacraments, its lavish cathedrals, even the cross itself, seem like traps of the devil. Their most dangerous idea, that salvation came not through priests or rituals but through direct spiritual knowledge. Cathar believers, known as perfecti, lived ascetic lives, refusing meat, wealth, and marriage, aiming to free their souls from the corruption of the material world. This struck at the heart of the Church's authority. If people didn't need intermediaries to reach God, what purpose did bishops or popes serve? The response was merciless. In the year 1209, Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade, named after the Cathar stronghold of Albi. For decades, armies marched through southern France, slaughtering not just Cathars but entire towns suspected of sheltering them. The massacre at Béziers became infamous when a papal legate was asked how to distinguish heretics from faithful Catholics. He reportedly declared, "Kill them all. God will know his own." Thousands perished, and with them their writings. The Church's final blow came in the year 1244, when the last Cathar fortress, Montségur, fell. Over 200 perfecti were burned alive in a single day, their libraries tossed into the flames. Among the lost texts was the Book of the Two Principles, a detailed Cathar theology that might have given us a fuller picture of their beliefs. Today, we know of it only through the angry refutations of their enemies, but the Cathars weren't alone. The Waldensians, another reformist group, met a similar fate. Founded by Peter Waldo in the 12th century, they preached poverty and vernacular translations of the Bible ideas that challenged the Church's monopoly on Scripture. Their texts, too, were hunted down and burned. Even the Humiliotti, a movement advocating simple living and manual labor, saw their writings destroyed when their criticism of clerical wealth grew too loud. What makes these losses so devastating is not just the suppression of dissent, but the erasure of diversity within Christianity itself. The medieval Church didn't just enforce orthodoxy, it rewrote history to make it seem as if no alternatives had ever existed. Surviving records describe the Cathars as devil worshippers or crazed fanatics, their true beliefs distorted by the hands that condemned them, yet traces remain. In remote caves of the Pyrenees, fragments of Cathar parchment have been found hidden in jars, their ink faded but their words still whispering of a world where faith took another shape. And in the echoes of later reformers Wycliffe, Hus, even Luther, we hear distant echoes of these forbidden voices. As the fires of Montségur cooled, the Church turned its gaze to another frontier of forbidden knowledge, not in Europe this time, but in the libraries of Islamic Spain, where Arabic science and philosophy thrived. The story of what was lost there awaits. Now, let's journey to a crossroads of civilizations, where the flames of censorship took aim at knowledge not for its content but for the language it was written in. While the Church purged heretical Christian texts in Europe, a parallel tragedy unfolded in the Iberian Peninsula, where the vast intellectual treasures of the Islamic world faced the same fate. By the 12th century, Spain was a beacon of learning under Muslim rule. Cities like Cordoba, Toledo, and Granada housed libraries that dwarfed those of Christian Europe, filled with works on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, many of them translations of ancient Greek texts lost to the West. Scholars from across the Mediterranean flocked to these centers, where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian thinkers collaborated in a rare spirit of intellectual exchange. The works of Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Hippocrates, preserved and expanded upon by Arabic commentators, flowed into Europe through these very channels. Yet this golden age faced a brutal reckoning. As Christian kingdoms reconquered Spain, the Church's suspicion of Arabic texts grew, not because they were wrong, but because they were foreign. Even as European scholars eagerly translated these books into Latin, Church authorities began to see them as threats. Why? Because they offered a vision of the universe that didn't rely on scripture. Arabic astronomy calculated the movements of planets with precision. Medical texts like those of Al-Razi and Ibn Sina described diseases and treatments based on observation, not prayer. And philosophers like Averroes argued for reason as a path to truth, challenging blind faith. The turning point came in the year 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west. In Granada, the last Muslim stronghold fell to Ferdinand and Isabella. Alongside the Alhambra decree expelling Jews, the monarchs ordered the confiscation of Arabic manuscripts. Inquisitors sifted through them, burning any that touched on un-Christian ideas. Among the losses were countless scientific treatises, poetry, and historical chronicles. Some were saved by sympathetic scholars who smuggled them out, but many vanished forever. One tragic example is the fate of the Toledo School of Translators. For centuries, this institution had been a bridge between cultures, rendering Arabic and Hebrew texts into Latin. But as the Inquisition tightened its grip, even these translators faced persecution. The Church feared that Arabic science could undermine its teachings, like the groundbreaking work of Alhazen on optics, which explained vision through anatomy and physics, not divine will. Similarly, the astronomical tables of Al-Zarqali, used to navigate seas and predict eclipses, were dismissed as sorcery by clerics who preferred biblical chronology. The irony is staggering. Many of the very texts the Church later embraced, like the medical canon of Ibn Sina, which became standard in European universities, were once at risk of destruction. Others weren't so lucky. The Kitab al-Hayya, Book of Astronomy by al-Farghani, which corrected Ptolemy's errors, survives only in fragments. Works on algebra, chemistry, and surgery by al-Khwarizmi, Jabir ibn Hayyan, and al-Zarawi were lost in bulk, their ideas rediscovered centuries later. What fueled this contradiction? Politics. As Spain sought to unify under Catholic rule, Arabic knowledge became a casualty of nationalism. Even useful science was condemned if it bore the taint of Islam. The same Church that later relied on Arabic medicine to combat plagues initially denounced it as heathenry. Yet whispers of this suppressed wisdom endured. In hidden monastery vaults and private collections, fragments survived. When Renaissance thinkers like Copernicus and Vesalius revolutionized science, they stood on the shoulders of Arabic giants, often without knowing it. The very books the Church tried to erase had already seeded Europe's intellectual rebirth. As we mourn these losses, another shadow looms: the silencing of women's voices in medieval scholarship, a purge equally systematic and far less acknowledged. That story, too, demands to be heard. But the flames of censorship did not stop with Arabic texts. As we turn the page to another chapter of lost knowledge, we encounter the tragic fate of Jewish mystical and scholarly works during Europe's darkest periods. While the Church targeted heretical Christian and Islamic writings, Jewish communities faced a parallel campaign of erasure, one that sought to dismantle not just their faith but their intellectual legacy. For centuries, Jewish scholars had preserved and expanded upon traditions of mystical thought, legal commentary, and philosophy. The Talmud, a vast compilation of rabbinic discussions on law, ethics, and history, served as the foundation of Jewish learning. Alongside it, Kabbalistic texts like the Zohar explored the divine through intricate symbolism, offering insights into the nature of creation and the soul. These works were not just religious, they were philosophical, scientific, and deeply woven into Jewish identity. Yet to medieval church authorities, they represented a threat. The Talmud was accused of blasphemy for its unflinching debates about scripture, while Kabbalah's esoteric teachings were labeled as magic. During the Albigensian Crusade in 13th century France, Jewish communities saw their libraries burned alongside those of the Cathars. In 1242, Paris witnessed one of the most infamous acts of censorship. 24 cartloads of Talmudic manuscripts were publicly set ablaze after a church-sponsored trial declared them heretical. This wasn't just about religion, it was about silencing a rival intellectual tradition. The attacks escalated with forced conversions. In Spain, the Inquisition demanded Jewish conversos, surrender all Hebrew texts. Families hid sacred books in walls or buried them, knowing discovery meant death. One heart-wrenching account describes a rabbi in Toledo who burned his own library rather than let inquisitors desecrate it. Among the losses were unique commentaries on the Torah, medical treatises blending Arabic and Jewish knowledge, and Kabbalistic works exploring cosmology. Some texts survived through sheer luck. The Palma Psalter, a Hebrew manuscript with stunning illuminations, was smuggled into Italy by a fleeing scribe. Fragments of the Aruch, a groundbreaking Talmudic dictionary, resurfaced centuries later in a monastery's attic. But most were lost forever, like the works of Isaac the Blind, a Kabbalist whose theories on divine energy anticipated later mystical thought. His writings, cited by later scholars, survive only as echoes in other texts. The irony, many church scholars secretly relied on Jewish knowledge. Kabbalah's numerology influenced Renaissance thinkers like Pico della Mirandola, while Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, a philosophical masterpiece, was studied by Thomas Aquinas despite its dangerous ideas. Yet the public stance remained hostile. In 1650, Pope Innocent X ordered the burning of every Hebrew book in Rome, a decree so sweeping it shocked even some clergy. What made these texts so threatening? They offered alternatives to church doctrine, not just theologically, but in how knowledge itself was pursued. Talmudic debate prized questioning and interpretation over dogmatic answers. Kabbalah's symbolic universe challenged literal readings of scripture, and Jewish medical texts like those of Asaph the physician blended empirical observation with ethics, an approach that unnerved authorities who saw healing as divine intervention. The losses were catastrophic. Without the Talmud's legal codices, entire traditions of Jewish jurisprudence vanished. Kabbalistic schools left gaps in mystical thought later thinkers struggled to reconstruct. And the destruction of scientific works, like Abraham Bar-Hiya's astronomical tables, set back fields that had thrived under interfaith collaboration. Yet resilience flickered in the shadows. Crypto-Jews preserved oral traditions, passing down forbidden knowledge in whispers. Printers in Venice and Constantinople risked persecution to publish Hebrew texts. And when the Enlightenment dawned, these fragments of a suppressed legacy would help reshape Europe's intellectual landscape, proof that even fire couldn't erase every spark. As we reflect on this silenced wisdom, another group's voice calls to us from the ashes, the women whose writings were erased not just by faith but by gender. Their story, long overlooked, is next. Now we turn to a loss often overlooked in the shadows of history, the voices of women, systematically erased not only by the fires of religious censorship but by the societal biases of an entire era. While the Church targeted texts it deemed heretical, women's writings faced a double condemnation. Their ideas were suppressed not just for challenging doctrine, but for daring to speak from a position the medieval world refused to acknowledge. Consider the fate of female mystics like Hildegard of Bingen, whose visionary works on medicine, theology, and cosmology narrowly escaped destruction because her male patrons shielded them. Most women weren't so fortunate. Take Trotula of Salerno, a pioneering 12th century physician whose treatises on women's health, covering everything from childbirth to herbal remedies, were later attributed to male authors or dismissed as folklore. Her original manuscripts vanished, surviving only in fragments plagiarized by others. Then there were the Beguines, laywomen who formed spiritual communities across Europe, writing devotional poetry and theological commentaries. Their independence living outside convents without male oversight made them suspect. When the Church labeled them heretics in the 14th century, their libraries were torched, erasing works like Marguerite Porreet's The Mirror of Simple Souls, a mystical text burned with her at the stake in Paris in 1310. Only 3 copies survived, hidden for centuries. Even literate noblewomen faced erasure. Helena of Aquitaine's court fostered female troubadours who composed poetry challenging marital norms, but their songs were labeled scandalous and systematically purged. In monasteries, scribes like Herod of Landsberg painstakingly compiled encyclopedias blending science and faith, only to have their contributions overwritten by male successors. A striking example is the Hortus Deliciarum, Herod's illuminated masterpiece, destroyed in the 1870 siege of Strasbourg. Today, we know its contents only from copies made by male scholars who rarely credited her. The disproportionate destruction of women's texts wasn't accidental. Female healers' herbal compendiums, like those of the Saxon abbess Hersvitha, were burned as witchcraft, while identical remedies written by men were preserved as medical science. Alchemists like Marie Lajuive pioneered early chemistry, yet her formulas were appropriated under male pseudonyms. The pattern was clear: women's knowledge was tolerated only when stripped of their identity. The silencing extended beyond Europe. In Moorish Spain, the polymath Lubna of Cordoba curated a library of over 500,000 volumes, including her own poetry and scientific translations, before the Christian reconquest scattered her legacy. Jewish midwives like Asenath Barzani wrote detailed obstetrics manuals, later condemned as superstition by inquisitors. Even Sappho's ancient lyrics, revered in Byzantium, were censored by monks who deemed them too sensual. What did we lose? Trotula's vanished gynecological studies could have advanced women's health care by centuries. The Beguine's egalitarian theology might have reshaped Christian thought. And the scientific collaborations between women like Hildegard and Arabic scholars, exchanges hinted at in surviving letters, could have bridged cultural divides earlier. Instead, gaps persist. For example, the Physica, Hildegard's treatise on natural medicine, survives in just one heavily edited manuscript, its original scope unknown. Yet fragments endure. In 1589, a midwife's manual was found bricked into a German wall, its margins filled with birthing techniques church authorities had banned. In 2018, multispectral imaging revealed a palimpsest, a recycled manuscript in which a 9th century nun's erased commentary on Aristotle was detected beneath a later monk's writing. These flickers hint at a vast, hidden corpus. The tragedy isn't just the loss of individual works, but the distortion of history itself. By erasing women's intellectual legacies, the medieval world crafted a narrative that cast them as passive or ignorant. But as we peel back those layers, another truth emerges. The fires didn't just burn books, they rewrote reality, and yet some truths refused to stay buried. As we'll soon see, even the Church's most meticulous censorship couldn't obliterate every counter-narrative. Beyond dogma, alternative histories lingered, waiting to be rediscovered. But history is rarely a single story, and hidden beneath the official records were chronicles that dared to tell a different tale. Imagine a version of Rome's fall not as divine punishment for paganism, but as a slow collapse fueled by corruption and inequality. Or saints who weren't serene martyrs, but complex figures entangled in political intrigue. These were the narratives that vanished into smoke, alternative histories that challenged the Church's carefully crafted version of the past. Take the Annals Maximi, Rome's earliest public chronicles kept by the high priests. Before their destruction, they reportedly contained unflinching accounts of emperors' scandals and military failures. Later Christian historians like Orosius recast Rome's decline as a moral lesson, erasing inconvenient truths. Similarly, the Gesta Dagobert, a Frankish chronicle, originally portrayed King Dagobert as a flawed ruler who clashed with bishops. By the time Charlemagne's scribes revised it centuries later, he'd been sanitized into a model Christian king. The lives of saints were particularly vulnerable to editing. The original Acts of Thecla, a 2nd century text, depicted a fiercely independent female disciple who baptized herself and defied patriarchal norms. Later versions, approved by the Church, diluted her story into conventional piety. In Byzantium, historians like Procopius wrote 2 versions of Emperor Justinian's reign. His official buildings praised the emperor, while the secret anecdota accused him of tyranny and occult practices. Only the flattering account survived in church libraries for centuries. Even biblical events were reinterpreted. The Apocalypse of Peter, popular in early Christian communities, described a merciful vision of hell where sinners could repent. When the Church standardized hell as eternal torment in the 4th century, this text was condemned. Fragments found in Egypt show it once circulated alongside the New Testament. Likewise, Irish monks preserved the Liber Gabola Iren, blending Christian and pagan Irish origin myths until Norman bishops suppressed it for its unorthodox depiction of Noah's descendants settling Ireland. The most subversive losses may be the counter-chronicles of marginalized groups. Gothic historians like Jordanes wrote of Arian Christian kings defending Rome better than the Orthodox emperors, a claim later erased when Arianism was declared heresy. In Spain, Mozarabic chronicles praised the Umayyad caliph's tolerance compared to Visigothic persecution of Jews. After the Reconquista, these manuscripts were labeled treasonous and burned. Some of the most tantalizing gaps involve everyday dissent. Parish records in 13th century France mention villagers who dismissed saints' miracles as old wives' tales, but their mocking ballads were destroyed. A surviving fragment from Mainz recounts a play where Saint Peter was portrayed as a bumbling fool until the local bishop ordered the script burned and its actors flogged. What do these omissions hide? Without the Gothic histories, we underestimate Rome's reliance on barbarian allies. Without Mozarabic accounts, the narrative of the Reconquista becomes one-sided triumph. And by silencing alternative saints' lives, the Church narrowed the definition of holiness to obedient martyrdom, erasing narratives of resistance, yet traces linger. In 1962, a palimpsest in Sign, I revealed a defaced Syriac chronicle praising Emperor Julian the Apostate's religious tolerance, a stark contrast to church histories branding him a villain. In 2010, scholars reconstructing a fire-damaged manuscript in Trier found a marginal note. Bishop Augustine burned 3 books here for claiming Constantine's conversion was political, not divine. These fragments remind us that history's winners didn't just write the records, they burned the competition. But as we'll discover next, not all forbidden knowledge stayed ashes. Some survived through sheer cunning, hidden in plain sight. Now, let's turn our attention to another realm of knowledge that faced the flames: medicine. While the Church promoted prayer and divine intervention as the primary cures, countless pagan healers, midwives, and physicians had spent centuries developing sophisticated remedies rooted in observation and tradition. Their texts, often seen as threats to church authority, were systematically destroyed. Consider the fate of the Herbarius, a compilation of Germanic herbal knowledge. It documented remedies like willow bark for pain, a precursor to aspirin, and moldy bread for infections, an early form of penicillin. Yet because these practices were tied to pagan rituals, the Church condemned them as devil's work. In the 8th century, Saint Boniface ordered the burning of sacred groves where Germanic healers gathered herbs, declaring their knowledge superstition. Surgery suffered a similar fate. Roman military doctors like Galen had pioneered techniques for treating wounds, fractures, and even cataracts. But as the Church elevated the soul over the body, invasive procedures were discouraged. Texts describing surgeries such as the Chirurgia of Paul of Aegina, which included diagrams for removing tumors, were locked away or destroyed. Meanwhile, monasteries promoted healing through relics and pilgrimages, leaving many to suffer from treatable conditions. Mental health treatments were especially targeted. Norse sagas mention healers using talk therapy and dream analysis, while Celtic druids employed calming herbs like chamomile for anxiety. But the Church reframed mental illness as demonic possession, burning manuals that suggested natural causes. In one notorious case, the Liber Medicinae, a Moorish-influenced text from Spain detailing depression treatments, was tossed into bonfires during the Inquisition for its heretical emphasis on diet and environment over prayer. Women's medical knowledge was erased most aggressively. Across Europe, midwives used ergot to ease childbirth pain and belladonna to regulate menstrual cycles, practices documented in books like the Trotula, a 12th-century compendium by female Italian doctors. But as male clergy took control of medicine, these texts were labeled witchcraft. By the 14th century, the Church's Malleus Maleficarum declared any woman who practiced healing a heretic, leading to countless executions and the loss of generations of expertise. Perhaps the greatest tragedy lies in what we'll never know. The Theriaca, a Roman antidote text said to contain cures for poisons, vanished when Goths sacked monasteries. Arabic translations of Hippocrates' works on contagion theory burned in Valencia during the Reconquista, and entire schools of thought, like the Visigothic physicians who traced illness to imbalances in the body's humors, were erased without a trace. Yet fragments persist. In 2014, a palimpsest in Monte Cassino revealed a scrap of a Greek herbal manual beneath a prayer book detailing a now-lost fever remedy. And in the Alps, elderly villagers still recite plant lore passed down from ancestors who memorized texts to avoid detection. These whispers remind us that knowledge, even when banned, finds a way to endure. As we'll see next, the Church's war on forbidden wisdom extended beyond texts into the very rituals and beliefs that once shaped daily life. But the purge of forbidden knowledge went far beyond medicine. Now, let's step into the shadowy world of Europe's lost magical traditions, a tapestry of spells, charms, and rituals that once connected people to the rhythms of the natural world. These practices, preserved in handwritten grimoires and oral traditions, were dismissed as devilry by the Church, fueling centuries of violent suppression. Imagine holding the Libri Magici, a collection of Celtic seasonal rites that taught farmers to bless their fields with lunar cycles, or the Galdrabok, an Icelandic manual of protective runes carved into whalebone. These weren't mere superstitions, they were intricate systems of spirituality, blending herbal lore, astronomy, and ancestral wisdom. Yet by the 12th century, such texts were torched as works of the devil, their authors branded heretics. Take the case of the Picatrix, a Spanish translation of an Arabic magical treatise. It detailed how to harness planetary energies for healing, a concept the Church twisted into necromancy. When a cache of these books was discovered in Toledo in 1281, Archbishop Sancho Roman II ordered them burned in the town square, declaring, "No man shall traffic with the stars." Similar fates befell Norse Seither manuals, which taught trance rituals to commune with spirits, and Slavic Zagabary texts containing harvest blessings. The destruction was shockingly thorough. In 1437, French inquisitors burned every copy of the Sworn Book of Honorius, a medieval grimoire that blended Christian prayers with older sigil magic. Venetian authorities confiscated and destroyed the Key of Solomon, a text now known only through fragments smuggled to Constantinople. Even seemingly harmless folk remedies like Irish fairy charms or Baltic dream interpretations were outlawed. A 1524 decree from Pope Adrian VI mandated that all books of geomancy, hydromancy, and pyromancy be delivered to the flames. Women once again bore the brunt of this erasure. Across Europe, village cunning folk, often elderly women, kept handwritten books of protective amulets and love spells. The Church demonized these as maleficium or harmful magic. In 1484, Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum declared, "Any woman who heals with herbs or reads omens is in league with Satan." Thousands of these handwritten notebooks, some passed down for generations, were burned alongside their owners during witch trials. The loss goes deeper than individual texts. Entire cosmologies vanished. The Finnic Kalevala tradition, which saw the universe as a singing web of energy, was nearly erased until 19th century folklorists recorded scraps. Lithuanian Dano's sacred songs encoding weather magic survived only because peasants memorized them in secret, and the great grimoire of the cunning people of Cornwall, said to contain tidal predictions based on megalithic alignments, was lost when their last keeper was hanged in 1632. Yet whispers remain. In 2018, scholars at Cambridge University identified a charmed 13th century belt buried in a Yorkshire well, its runes matching a banned spell for safe childbirth. And in remote Transylvanian villages, healers still recite incantations identical to those condemned in medieval trial records. These fragments remind us that fire couldn't fully extinguish humanity's oldest conversations with the unseen. Next, we'll uncover how even the most beautiful poetry became kindling when it celebrated the wrong gods. But the silencing of voices did not end with spells and grimoires. Another casualty of the Church's purges was poetry lines of lyrical beauty that dared to honor the old gods or revel in the joys of mortal life. These verses, sung in taverns and whispered in orchards, were branded as dangerous temptations, their very existence a threat to pious minds. Consider the Carmina Burana, a collection of medieval poems discovered in a Bavarian monastery. Many of these songs celebrated springtime, love, and the intoxicating freedom of youth, themes the Church deemed frivolous at best, sinful at worst. One surviving fragment praises the Roman goddess Flora with lines like, "She walks in crowns of vine and rose, her laughter turning winter's frost to honey." Manuscripts containing such verses were routinely defaced or burned, their vibrant imagery reduced to ashes. In Ireland, the Philid poets trained in ancient oral traditions composed intricate verses honoring deities like Brigid, the goddess of poetry and smithcraft. Their works wove together nature, myth, and history in complex meter. But after the Synod of Whitby in 664, which aligned Irish Christianity with Roman doctrine, these poets faced persecution. A 9th century decree from Armagh ordered the destruction of all lays praising the false gods of the Gael. Only fragments survive, like the Song of Amagin, a haunting invocation of land and spirit that monks preserved by disguising it as a Christian hymn. The suppression extended beyond pagan themes. Even secular poetry celebrating earthly pleasures met violent resistance. Take the Goliards, wandering scholars of the 12th century who wrote satirical verses mocking church corruption and extolling wine, dance, and romance. Their defiant lyrics, like "In the tavern we die, where the cups are our mourners," so enraged authorities that Pope Innocent III issued a bull in 1211 condemning their obscene doggerel. Manuscripts were seized from university towns across Europe, their pages fed to bonfires. Women's poetic voices suffered doubly. The works of Sappho, the ancient Greek poetess, were still read in medieval Constantinople until Patriarch Photios declared her lyrics a school of vice in the 9th century. Copies of her poems, especially those celebrating love between women, were systematically destroyed. Similarly, the Trobarites of Occitania, noble women who composed courtly love poetry in the 12th century, saw their works censored after the Albigensian Crusade. A troubadour's song might survive if it praised a knight's devotion to his lady, but a woman's verse describing her own desires, that was fuel for the flames. The loss was cultural as much as artistic. Norse skaldic poetry, with its intricate kennings and allusions to myths, was nearly erased during Scandinavia's Christianization. When King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway converted in 996, he ordered skalds to either compose hymns or face execution. an entire stanzaic tradition, once used to record histories and laws, faded into silence. Only fragments endure, like the runital section of the Havamal, saved because a scribe tucked it into a Christian codex, yet traces linger. In 2014, a palimpsest in an Italian archive revealed a 9th century love poem scratched beneath a Latin psalm. Its closing lines, "Your breath is my north star, your pulse my drum," echo the very human longings the Church sought to erase. And in Iceland, farmers still recite rimmer, epic ballads preserving snippets of pre-Christian verse, proof that fire couldn't fully silence the music of the past. Now let's turn to the shadowy realm of alternative scriptures texts that offered visions of faith too radical for the medieval church to tolerate. But the suppression of poetry was just one facet of a much wider campaign. Now we enter a hidden world of sacred texts, alternative scriptures that once offered paths to faith too unorthodox for the church to allow. Long before the Bible's canon was firmly established, countless spiritual works circulated through Europe, presenting visions of divinity that challenged official doctrine. Take the Oracles of Hystaspes, a Zoroastrian-influenced text beloved by early Christian mystics. It prophesied a cosmic battle between light and darkness, with a savior descending to purify the earth, a vision so compelling that church fathers like Lactantius praised it in the 3rd century. Yet by the 5th century, as orthodoxy hardened, copies were hunted down for promoting dualism, the heresy that good and evil were equal forces. Today, we know of it only through hostile quotations in sermons condemning it. Equally controversial were the Jubilees and Enochian texts, ancient Jewish works that expanded Genesis with tales of fallen angels teaching humanity forbidden arts. Medieval Irish monks still copied these in the 7th century, fascinated by their detailed astronomy and angelic hierarchies. But when church councils declared them reckless speculation, monasteries from Lindisfarne to Reichenau burned their copies. A single charred page of the Book of Enoch survived in a Coptic monastery's waste pile, only rediscovered in 1972. Then there were the Infancy Gospels, colorful accounts of Jesus' childhood that thrived in folk tradition. The Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew described a boy Christ animating clay birds, while the Infancy Gospel of Thomas told of him striking dead a playmate who angered him. These texts, once read aloud at winter festivals, were banned by the Synod of Toledo in 633 for portraying Christ as too human. Thousands of copies vanished, though traces linger in medieval art, like a French cathedral carving showing young Jesus carrying a basket of his clay sparrows. The Waldensians, a 13th century movement insisting on vernacular scripture, produced their own translations of Psalms and Acts. Their handwritten booklets, smuggled from house to house in Provençal and Piedmontese dialects, were deemed especially dangerous because they bypassed Latin, the Church's language of control. When inquisitors raided a Waldensian home in 1283, one recorded burning a chest of little books that let plowmen argue theology like clerks. Only 7 fragments survive, all found lining the soles of shoes, hidden there as insulation against winter cold. Perhaps most haunting are the lost scriptures of the Bogomils, a dualist sect flourishing in the Balkans. Their secret book described Satan as God's rebellious firstborn, who fashioned the material world as a prison for souls. Byzantine chroniclers claim Bogomil missionaries carried miniature versions sewn into their sleeves, written in a cipher of Greek and Slavic runes. After the fall of their stronghold at Philippopolis in 1241, Crusaders boasted of burning 200 heretical codices in the marketplace. Modern scholars have yet to find a single intact page, yet echoes persist. In 2018, spectral imaging revealed ghostly lines beneath a Bulgarian monastery's hymn book, a palimpsest showing a Bogomil hymn to the uncreated light. And in the Alps, shepherds still recount the legend of the Liver sans Nom, a Waldensian text supposedly hidden in a cave, its pages whispering secrets to those pure of heart. Though fire consumed most alternative scriptures, their ideas like sparks carried on the wind still glow in unexpected places. Now, let's examine the ruthless efficiency with which these texts were hunted down and destroyed, the mechanics of literary annihilation. The systematic eradication of these forbidden texts was not some haphazard act of zealotry. It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign that unfolded over centuries. Let's pull back the curtain on the machinery of destruction itself. Public burnings were the church's most theatrical weapon. Picture town squares packed with onlookers as bishops presided over pyres of parchment, their flames framed as righteous purges. In 1239, the Archbishop of Sens staged such a spectacle with 24 wagonloads of Cathar texts, so many that the heat cracked nearby stained glass windows. These events weren't merely punitive, they were propaganda. Witnesses described how priests would ritually deface books before burning, scraping off illuminations with knives to kill their heresies symbolically first. A 14th century chronicle from Carcassonne records how inquisitors forced repentant heretics to personally hurl their own books into the flames as proof of conversion. But behind these grand displays lay a quieter, more insidious operation: the nocturnal raids. Monastic librarians often received secret orders to surrender suspect volumes to visiting bishops. At Cluny Abbey in 1122, the abbot resisted until armed men broke into the scriptorium at night, carrying off 7 chests of manuscripts by torchlight. Some librarians tried subterfuge, hiding controversial works behind false cabinet backs or burying them in vegetable gardens. The Vercelli Codex, a rare survivor, was found centuries later stuffed inside a chimney, its pages blackened not by fire but by centuries of soot. The real devastation came from within. Monastery purges saw trusted clerics methodically combing their own libraries under papal directives. At Monte Cassino in 896, a reformist abbot catalogued, then destroyed hundreds of dangerous texts, replacing them with approved volumes. His diary chillingly notes erasing 8 books of astrology and 32 pagan poets in 1 month. St. Gall's Abbey in Switzerland went further. Their purge records show scribes actually overwriting forbidden texts with orthodox works, creating palimpsests that only modern technology can now decipher. The logistics were ruthlessly efficient. Dominican inquisitors employed book hunters who tracked down private collections using informants. In 1285, one such hunter in Toulouse boasted of identifying 79 households by the scent of their ink. Oil lamps burning late over copying desks left telltale smudges on door frames. Seized books faced tribunals where they were literally put on trial. A 12th century ledger from Verona lists expenses for chains to bind heretical codices during questioning. Perhaps most devastating were the targeted attacks on entire libraries. When the Teutonic Knights conquered Prussia's pagan temples in 1236, they systematically burned every captured text, including medicinal herbals and land treaties, simply because they were written in the old Prussian script. Similarly, after crushing the Hussite rebellion in 1436, Catholic forces destroyed over 400 volumes from Prague's Bethlehem Chapel, home to Europe's first vernacular hymnals. Yet even in destruction, there were strange reversals. Some condemned texts survived precisely because they were taken as trophies. The infamous Codex Gigas, containing occult imagery, was spared by being imprisoned in a Benedictine vault where monks would exhibit it to pilgrims as proof of the Church's power over darkness. Other works lived on through fragments. A 13th century leper colony near Marseille used pages from a Gnostic Gospel as bandages, inadvertently preserving them in antiseptic honey wrappings. The scale of loss becomes clear when we examine specific libraries. The great Visigothic collection at Toledo, holding ancient Hispanic chronicles and Mozarabic liturgies, was purged 3 separate times between 1085 and 1210. Each raid left fewer survivors. By the last, only 4 manuscripts remained from an original archive of 2,000. Similarly, the scriptorium at Bobbio Abbey, once housing Cicero's Lost to Gloria, was reduced to copying only penitential psalms by 1400. What makes this systematic obliteration so jarring is its bureaucratic precision. Surviving expense reports from Avignon show payments for 20 loads of kindling for heretic books, alongside routine purchases like choir robes. A papal legate's letter from 1291 casually mentions stopping in Piacenza to burn the municipal archives pre-Christian deeds en route to a diplomatic meeting. This normalization of destruction ensured that by the Renaissance, generations had grown up unaware of what once existed, but the story doesn't end with ashes. Next, we'll uncover the miraculous survivors, those rare texts that slip through the flames to whisper secrets across time. Now, against all odds, let's turn our attention to the remarkable survivors, those fragile threads of knowledge that somehow slip through the fingers of censors and flames. These texts didn't just endure by accident. Many survived through acts of quiet defiance or sheer luck, offering us glimpses into worlds the Church tried to erase. Take the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945 by a farmer digging for fertilizer in the Egyptian desert. Inside a sealed clay jar lay 52 papyrus codices, including the Gospel of Thomas and other Gnostic texts banned since the 4th century. These manuscripts had been hidden by monks who risked everything to preserve them, burying them like time capsules in the harsh cliffs above the Nile. The dry desert air acted as a natural preservative, keeping these radical visions of Christianity intact for over 1,600 years. Equally miraculous are the palimpsests' manuscripts where forbidden texts were scraped away to make room for approved works. Modern imaging technology has revealed ghostly traces of the original words beneath. The Archimedes palimpsest, for example, was overwritten with prayers in the 13th century, but beneath those pious lines lay the only surviving copies of the Greek mathematician's groundbreaking treatises, including the method of mechanical theorems. Scholars using ultraviolet light have spent decades piecing together these erased ideas, proving that even when the Church tried to recycle parchment, the past refused to disappear completely. Some texts survived through sheer cultural stubbornness. The Carmina Burana, a collection of medieval Goliad poems mocking church authority, endured because wandering scholars kept copying them secretly. These raucous verses celebrating wine and earthly pleasures were passed hand to hand in taverns and universities, their survival proof that not all rebels wore armor, some carried ink pots. Similarly, Icelandic sagas preserving pre-Christian Norse myths owe their existence to remote farmsteads where scribes worked far from papal scrutiny. The Flateyjarbók, compiled in the late 14th century, contains pagan tales side by side with Christian texts, a quiet act of cultural preservation. Then there are the fragments preserved through bizarre twists of fate. In the ruins of Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, archaeologists found thousands of papyrus scraps in ancient trash heaps, including lines from Sappho's poetry and lost plays by Sophocles. These weren't saved intentionally, they were used as landfill, mummified by Egypt's arid climate. Even more surprising are the binding fragments, sheets of forbidden texts torn up by bookbinders to reinforce covers of approved works. A 15th century Latin grammar book in Manchester was found to have pages from a 9th century Irish herbal sewn into its spine, the plant illustration still visible. Perhaps the most poignant survivors are those saved by enemies. Arabic scholars in Al-Andalus meticulously translated and preserved Greek philosophy that Europe was burning. When Toledo fell to Christian forces in 1085, these very translations of Aristotle, Hippocrates, and Ptolemy were rediscovered by European scholars, sparking the Renaissance. Irony of ironies, the knowledge the Church tried to suppress in the West was kept alive by the civilizations it crusaded against. Even within the Church itself, pockets of resistance existed. The Codex Amiatinus, created in 8th century Northumbria, secretly incorporated Vulgate Bible passages with older, suspect Latin versions. the scribes disguised their work so well that it became the template for medieval Bible's heresy hiding in plain sight. Similarly, the Rossano Gospels, illuminated in 6th century Byzantium, contain symbols from condemned Gnostic traditions subtly woven into their artwork, visible only to those who knew where to look. The survival of these texts reminds us that censorship is never total. From desert caves to trash piles, from beneath layers of pious overwriting to the bindings of approved books, fragments of forbidden knowledge always find a way to whisper to the future. And as we'll soon see, some of these whispers are now growing louder than ever. Shifting our focus from what survived to what was lost, we arrive at the staggering scale of destruction entire libraries erased from history. Some of these collections were so vast and significant that their burning represents not just the loss of books, but the silencing of entire civilizations. Consider the Visigothic Library of Toledo, a treasure trove of knowledge amassed during the Iberian Peninsula's Golden Age. When Muslim forces captured the city in 712, they preserved its intellectual wealth, translating Greek and Latin texts into Arabic. But centuries later, when Christian crusaders reclaimed Toledo, they purged entire sections of the library, targeting works they deemed heretical. Among the losses were Visigothic law codes, unique chronicles of early medieval Europe, and translations of Neoplatonic philosophy, texts that could have rewritten our understanding of the period. Equally devastating was the systematic dismantling of the monastic scriptorium at Bobbio in northern Italy. Founded in the 7th century, Bobbio became one of Europe's foremost centers of learning, housing ancient Latin manuscripts and rare Irish theological texts. By the 12th century, church authorities ordered a purge of its collections, stripping away anything that conflicted with approved doctrine. Manuscripts on herbal medicine, Celtic Christian rituals, and even fragments of lost Roman plays were burned or scraped into palimpsests. Today, scholars still mourn the loss of Bobbio's De Medicina, a compendium of pre-Christian healing knowledge cited by other medieval writers but now vanished. Then there's the tragic case of the Library of the Caesars in Constantinople. Unlike the famous Library of Alexandria, this imperial collection endured into the Middle Ages, safeguarding pagan philosophical works alongside early Christian texts. But during the iconoclasm riots of the 8th and 9th centuries, zealots destroyed thousands of volumes, including the last known copies of Porphyry's against the Christians and dozens of Hellenistic scientific treatises. Contemporary accounts describe parchment sheets floating like ash snow over the Bosporus. Perhaps most chilling is the fate of the Cathar libraries of Languedoc. When the Albigensian Crusade crushed this dissident Christian sect in the 13th century, armies torched their scriptoriums with such thoroughness that only 3 Cathar texts survive today. Among the lost works was the Book of the Two Principles, a radical exploration of dualist theology that church chroniclers referenced only to condemn. Modern historians speculate it might have offered an entirely alternative vision of Christian origins, one we'll never fully know. Even seemingly secure repositories weren't safe. The library of the Abbey of Monte Cassino, perched high in the Apennines, was looted and burned multiple times, first by Lombards in the 6th century, then by Saracens in 983. Each attack erased irreplaceable texts, including Benedictine rulebooks with marginal notes that may have preserved older monastic traditions. These weren't random acts of violence but targeted campaigns to control knowledge. When Charlemagne's successors reformed church liturgy in the 9th century, they ordered the destruction of older sacramentaries' liturgical books that reflected regional variations in worship. At the Council of Paris in 829, bishops explicitly called for the burning of non-standard prayer texts, ensuring uniformity at the cost of diversity. Yet in the shadows of these losses, tantalizing clues remain. Catalogues from the Library of St. Gall in Switzerland list dozens of works, from Aristotle's Poetics to lost Roman histories, that vanished during later purges. Medieval book inventories from Cluny Abbey mention titles like the Mirror of Souls, a mystical tract now known only by name. These ghostly references haunt historians, reminders that every line in a catalogue represents a universe of thought reduced to ashes. As we piece together these fragments, one truth becomes clear. Each destroyed library was a world unto itself, a fragile ecosystem of ideas extinguished not by time but by deliberate fire. And yet, as we'll soon discover, the story doesn't end there, because the quest to recover what was lost has taken extraordinary turns in our own era. The echoes of medieval book burnings didn't fade with the Middle Ages. In fact, the Church's campaign to control knowledge evolved into something even more systematic: the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or Index of Prohibited Books. First published in 1559, this infamous list wasn't just a continuation of censorship, it was a refined, bureaucratic machine for silencing dissent. Imagine a world where a single decree could erase ideas from public consciousness. That's exactly what the Index achieved. Unlike the chaotic burnings of medieval times, this was a calculated effort. The Vatican maintained the list for over 4 centuries, updating it regularly to include new, dangerous texts. Over 3,000 titles were eventually banned, from scientific works by Galileo to philosophical writings by Descartes. Even authors like Voltaire and Sartre found their way onto the list, proving that the Church's grip on intellectual freedom lasted well into the modern era. What's chilling is how the Index borrowed tactics from those early medieval purges. Just as Charlemagne's bishops had targeted non-standard liturgical books, the Index outlawed vernacular translations of the Bible-fearing laypeople might interpret scripture without priestly guidance. And much like the destruction of Cathar texts, the Index banned entire categories of thought. Copernicus's revolutionary work on heliocentrism was condemned, delaying the acceptance of his discoveries for decades. The enforcement was brutal too. Printers caught producing banned books faced excommunication or worse. In Spain, the Inquisition burned not just books but sometimes their owners. One notorious case involved the humanist printer Juan de Valdés, whose translations of the New Testament were seized and torched in 1532 along with his workshop. This wasn't just about destroying paper, it was about terrifying others into compliance. Yet the Index had a paradoxical effect. By drawing attention to banned works, it inadvertently created a black market for forbidden knowledge. Wealthy collectors secretly traded illicit texts, much like how fragments of Gnostic Gospels had survived medieval purges in hidden caves. Even some clergy quietly preserved condemned books in private libraries. The Benedictine monastery of San Giovanni in Carbonara, for instance, was discovered in the 18th century to have hoarded hundreds of prohibited scientific texts behind false walls. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the Index is how it mirrors earlier losses. When scholars tally the gaps in our historical record, the missing works of Hypatia, the vanished libraries of Toledo, they're often staring at absences created by the same mindset that fueled the Index. The medieval church burned books it deemed heretical. The post-Reformation church bureaucratized that impulse. Both systems shared a core belief that controlling knowledge was key to controlling truth. By the time the Index was finally abolished in 1966, the damage was immeasurable. Generations had been denied access to groundbreaking ideas, from evolutionary theory to feminist thought. And while we can now read Galileo's banned dialogues or Kant's censored essays, we're left wondering how many other voices were permanently silenced. How many intellectual revolutions never happened because their spark was smothered in advance? This isn't just history. It's a warning about how easily systems of censorship can outlive their creators, shaping what we know and what we'll never know for centuries to come. And as we'll see next, that legacy isn't confined to Europe. Across continents and cultures, the same patterns emerge. Knowledge rises and power tries to erase it. The ripple effects of these centuries of book burnings and censorship stretch far beyond the piles of ash left in town squares. Stepping back, we can see how this systematic suppression of knowledge didn't just erase individual texts, it altered the very trajectory of Europe's intellectual evolution. Think of it like pruning a tree, not just of its dead branches, but of every promising new shoot. The result, a stunted growth that took generations to overcome. Take the field of medicine, for example. When the Church destroyed ancient Greek and Arabic medical texts like those of Galen or Avicenna, they weren't just burning parchment. They were dismantling centuries of accumulated wisdom about anatomy, surgery, and disease. Without these works, European physicians lost access to advanced concepts like germ theory precursors or detailed surgical techniques. The consequences were dire. For hundreds of years, treatments regressed to superstitious practices like bloodletting, while epidemics raged unchecked. It wasn't until the Renaissance, when surviving Arabic manuscripts were rediscovered in Spain, that medicine began to recover. Had those texts never been banned, how many lives might have been saved? Then there's astronomy. The suppression of heliocentric theories, first hinted at in ancient works, then proven by Copernicus, kept Europe clinging to an Earth-centered universe for far longer than necessary. This wasn't just about dogma, it had practical repercussions. Navigational charts based on flawed models led ships astray, delaying exploration. Calendar reforms stalled, throwing agriculture and religious observances into chaos. Even the Church eventually admitted its mistake, but only after centuries of resistance. The social costs were equally profound. By silencing alternative Christian movements like the Cathars or Waldensians, the Church eliminated entire schools of thought about poverty, equality, and communal living. These groups had challenged feudal hierarchies and championed education for the laity, ideas that might have softened Europe's rigid class divisions. Instead, their eradication reinforced a status quo where literacy and power remained in the hands of a privileged few. Perhaps most heartbreaking is the silencing of women's voices. When texts by female scholars like Hildegard of Bingen or Trotula of Salerno were dismissed as heresy or witchcraft, it didn't just erase their contributions, it sent a message that women's intellect had no place in the public sphere. The reverberations of that exclusion echo even today, with histories that still overlook medieval women's roles in science, philosophy, and theology. Even art and literature suffered. The burning of pagan poetry and Greco-Roman dramas didn't just deprive audiences of entertainment, it severed Europe from its creative roots. Imagine how different Chaucer or Shakespeare might have been if they'd had access to the full breadth of classical storytelling, instead of just fragments filtered through church-approved sources. Yet the most insidious impact might be psychological. When generations are taught that curiosity itself is dangerous, that asking certain questions could bring punishment, it breeds intellectual timidity. This helps explain why Europe's scientific revolution came so late compared to other civilizations. The mindset cultivated by centuries of censorship lingered long after the flames died down, making thinkers hesitate before challenging orthodoxy. But here's the twist: this suppression also planted seeds of its own undoing. The very act of banning works like Galileo's dialogue made them irresistible to clandestine readers, fueling underground networks of intellectuals. By the Enlightenment, these forbidden ideas became rallying cries against church authority. In a bitter irony, the Index's attempt to control discourse ultimately accelerated the secularization it feared. The lesson here isn't just about historical what-ifs. It's about recognizing how fragile knowledge ecosystems are and how easily their disruption can delay human progress for centuries. As we turn next to modern rediscoveries of long-lost texts, we'll see glimmers of what might have been and what still could be. Now, let's turn a corner from what was lost to what has been miraculously found. While countless texts were reduced to ashes, some works defied the odds, surviving in the unlikeliest of places. these modern rediscoveries aren't just strokes of luck, they're windows into the minds and worlds we thought were gone forever. Take the Nag Hammadi Library, for instance. In 1945, a farmer digging near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi stumbled upon a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing over 50 texts, including the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, Gnostic scriptures banned and hunted by the early church. These weren't just fragments, they were complete works preserved by dry desert air and the care of those who hid them. Suddenly, we had direct access to the mystical Christianity the church tried to erase, revealing a Jesus who spoke in riddles about divine sparks within every person. It was as if a door had been kicked open in a wall we didn't even know existed. Then there's the Archimedes palimpsest. This 10th century parchment was scraped clean in the Middle Ages to make room for a prayer book, a common practice when parchment was scarce. But beneath those prayers, barely visible, lay some of Archimedes' most advanced mathematical treatises, including the method, which explained how he calculated volumes and areas centuries before calculus. Modern multispectral imaging, a technology that uses different light wavelengths to reveal faded ink, allowed scholars to read what was once considered irretrievable. The implications are staggering. Had these works not been overwritten, might Europe have grasped calculus centuries earlier? In a monastery on Mount Sinai, another miracle emerged. The Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest complete Bibles in existence, was found in the 1800s with entire sections missing. Then, in 1975, a worker repairing a wall discovered a hidden chamber. Inside were thousands of parchment fragments, among them the missing pages of the Codex. These weren't just old Bible pages, they contained subtle but crucial differences from later versions, showing how the biblical text evolved under church editing. Even charred fragments have yielded treasures. In the ruins of the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum, a Roman town buried by Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, librarians are using CT scans to read scrolls carbonized by volcanic heat. These scans can detect the density of ink inside the tightly wound layers without unrolling them. Among the texts identified so far are lost works by Seneca the Elder and Epicurean philosophy that challenge our understanding of Roman intellectual life. Perhaps the most poignant rediscovery came from a sewage ditch in Oxford. In 2018, archaeologists sifting through medieval latrine waste found parchment scraps covered in Hebrew writing. These turned out to be pages from a 12th century copy of the Talmud, meticulously torn by church authorities during a public burning. The fact that someone rescued these fragments, hiding them in the last place anyone would look, speaks volumes about the desperation to preserve knowledge. Technology continues to rewrite what's possible. X-ray fluorescence can now detect traces of iron or copper in ink on completely blackened pages. Artificial intelligence is being trained to reconstruct text from scattered fragments, like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle where most pieces are missing. Each breakthrough chips away at the church's long shadow, proving that even the most thorough censorship can't extinguish ideas forever. What's thrilling isn't just the recovery of individual texts, but the patterns they reveal. Many survived because they were smuggled beyond Europe's borders, to Islamic libraries, Ethiopian monasteries, or Indian trading ports. Others were hidden in plain sight, disguised as something innocuous. Together, they remind us that knowledge has always found a way to outlast those who try to contain it. As we stand on the brink of uncovering even more like the potential library still buried at Herculaneum, it's worth asking, what other game-changing ideas might be waiting in the dark, ready to rewrite history? But before we marvel too long at what has been found, let's reckon with the sobering reality of what we know was lost forever. The fire and the sword took more than we can measure, but surviving records, inventories, condemnations, even passing references in letters, give us glimpses of the treasures that once existed. These lists are like shadows on a cave wall, hinting at the shape of knowledge we'll never fully grasp. Consider the Sibylline books of Rome. These ancient prophetic texts written by priestesses of Apollo guided Roman leaders for centuries. Emperors consulted them during crises, trusting their cryptic verses. But when the Christian emperor Honorius ordered them burned in the early 5th century, an entire system of pagan wisdom vanished overnight. We know they existed because Roman historians like Livy and Tacitus quoted them, but their full content gone. The same fate befell the works of the philosopher Porphyry. A critic of Christianity in the 3rd century, his 15-volume Against the Christians was so feared by the Church that multiple emperors ordered its destruction. Only fragments survive, quoted by Church fathers who sought to refute him. From these scraps, we know Porphyry attacked inconsistencies in the Gospels and questioned the divinity of Christ's arguments so potent they haunted the Church for centuries. Then there's the tragic case of Hypatia of Alexandria, the mathematician and astronomer's personal library filled with her own treatises on geometry and revised editions of works by Euclid and Ptolemy, was burned by a Christian mob in 415. We know she existed because her student Synesius praised her brilliance in letters, but her original contributions to science reduced to ashes with her life. The Cathars, a medieval Christian sect, left almost no trace of their beliefs because every one of their texts was burned during the Albigensian Crusade. Survivors mentioned a sacred book called the Book of the Two Principles, which outlined their dualist worldview, but not a single page remains. Similarly, the Bogomils of Eastern Europe left only echoes in the accusations of their enemies. Jewish communities suffered equally. During the Disputation of Paris in 1240, French authorities burned 24 cartloads of Talmudic manuscripts, thousands of commentaries and legal texts painstakingly copied over generations. Rabbis of the time made lists of the destroyed works, mourning titles like the Scroll of Secrets, a mystical text mentioned in medieval Jewish poetry. Even scientific knowledge wasn't spared. The Roman architect Vitruvius casually mentions in De Architectura that his work is just a summary of earlier Greek treatises, titles like Pythias on the proportions of temples or Theodorus' writings on dockyards. These were the textbooks of antiquity, now known only by name. Some losses hit closer to home. The Venerable Bede, an 8th century English monk, wrote that his monastery once possessed songs and poems in the old Anglo-Saxon tongue pagan verses celebrating heroes like Beowulf. None survive from his time, likely scrubbed away by later Christian scribes who saw them as dangerous relics of a heathen past. The most haunting gaps come from authors who mention their own lost works. The theologian Origen, in the 3rd century, wrote that he'd authored a massive study comparing different versions of the Old Testament, a project that would have revolutionized biblical scholarship. But in a letter, he laments that the manuscript was lost in the Troubles, likely during one of Rome's persecutions. Even when titles survive, their contents are maddeningly opaque. Medieval library catalogues list books like the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary alchemical text, but the original Greek version disappeared centuries ago. What we have now are Arabic and Latin translations, likely altered in the retelling. These lists are more than footnotes. They're a fossil record of intellectual diversity, proving how much richer our understanding of history could be. Every time a scholar stumbles upon a reference to a lost work, like the Chronicle of Fredegar mentioning a pagan history of the Franks, it's a reminder of how much was stolen from us. Not by time, but by deliberate erasure. And yet, in a twist of irony, we often know exactly why these works were targeted. The very records the Church kept to condemn heresies, like the Decretum Gelasianum, a list of banned books, became our guide to what once existed. The censors, in their zeal, preserved the memory of what they sought to destroy. Now it's up to us to listen to those echoes. Now, as we reflect on the deliberate destruction of knowledge in medieval Europe, it's worth stepping back to see how this pattern, this fear of ideas, has echoed across continents and centuries. Because the burning of books is not unique to the Church. It's a tragic thread woven through human history, a tool used by those in power to silence dissent, rewrite narratives, and control what future generations would remember. Take the Qin dynasty in ancient China, for example. In 213 BCE, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, ordered what became known as the burning of books and burying of scholars. His goal was simple: to erase any philosophical or historical text that contradicted his legalist ideology, which emphasized strict obedience to the state. Confucian texts were the primary target, along with records of past rulers whose wisdom might challenge his authority. Only practical manuals on agriculture, medicine, and prophecy were spared. Thousands of bamboo scrolls, centuries of poetry, philosophy, and history went up in flames, and just as in Europe, the Qin dynasty's censors were meticulous. They even killed scholars who resisted, burying them alive to ensure their knowledge died with them. Today, we know about these lost works only because later historians like Sima Qian risked their lives to preserve fragments in secret. Jump forward to 16th century Mesoamerica, and you'll find another devastating campaign against knowledge: the destruction of the Maya codices. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, they encountered a civilization with a rich written tradition, thousands of folded bark paper books detailing astronomy, mathematics, and sacred rituals. But to the Spanish clergy, these were works of the devil. In 1562, Bishop Diego de Landa orchestrated a mass burning in Mani, Yucatan, destroying every Maya codex he could find. Only 4 survived, hidden by communities who risked everything to protect them. Landa later admitted, in a bitter twist, that Chinese letter burning of books and burying of scholars' acts had erased knowledge even he recognized as valuable. Like the Mayas' precise astronomical calculations, which far surpassed European understanding at the time. Even the Islamic world, often celebrated for preserving ancient texts, has its own shadows. The 13th century siege of Baghdad by the Mongols wasn't just a military catastrophe, it was an intellectual one. When the city fell in 1258, its legendary House of Wisdom, a library holding Greek philosophy, Persian poetry, and scientific treatises, was reportedly thrown into the Tigris River. The water ran black with ink for days. Some historians debate the scale, but the symbolic loss is undeniable. A crossroads of global knowledge erased in an instant. What's striking about these parallels is how familiar the justifications sound. Whether it's Qin Shi Huang fearing dissent, the Spanish church denouncing pagan science, or the Mongols dismantling a rival's identity, the rhetoric is eerily similar to that of medieval Europe. Power, it seems, has always understood that controlling knowledge means controlling history itself. And in every case, the losses are incalculable. We'll never know how Chinese philosophy might have evolved if Confucian debates had survived the Qin purges. We can only guess what breakthroughs Maya astronomers might have achieved if their star charts had been allowed to spread. Yet there's a quiet defiance in these stories too. After the Qin dynasty fell, scholars reconstructed Confucian texts from memory and hidden caches. Maya scribes, under Spanish rule, began secretly recording their history in hybrid books, mixing indigenous and European formats. And in Baghdad, scattered manuscripts survived in places like Moorish Spain, where translators kept the flame of ancient learning alive. These acts of resilience remind us that while books burn, ideas are harder to kill. They slip through cracks, hide in oral traditions, and resurface when the world is ready. So when we mourn the libraries of medieval Europe, we're also mourning a global legacy of loss and recognizing the fragile threads that still connect us to the past. Because every time a society burns books, it's not just paper they're destroying. It's the possibility of a different future. But even as we piece together the fragments of what was lost, the shadows of these vanished texts have given rise to whispered stories that blur the line between history and legend. Somewhere between the ashes of burned libraries and the gaps in our understanding, conspiracy theories take root. And when it comes to forbidden knowledge, few topics spark as much fascination or misinformation as the idea of deliberately suppressed secrets. Take the legend of the Emerald Tablet, for instance. This ancient text, attributed to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus, was said to hold the secrets of alchemy and divine wisdom. Some claim the Church destroyed every copy to keep its transformative knowledge from the masses. But here's the truth. While the original tablet likely never existed in physical form, fragments of Hermetic teachings did survive in Arabic and medieval European manuscripts hidden in plain sight. The Church didn't erase it, they just didn't highlight it. Then there's the enduring myth of the Cathar treasure. Stories swirl that when the Cathars were annihilated in the Albigensian Crusade, their last guardians smuggled out a cache of heretical texts, perhaps even evidence of Jesus' bloodline or lost Christian Gospels. Modern treasure hunters still scour the French Pyrenees for clues, but historians point out that while the Cathars certainly had unique beliefs, no credible evidence suggests they possessed secret scriptures. Their real treasure was their radical defiance of church authority, a defiance that made them dangerous enough to destroy without needing added mysteries. And who hasn't heard the rumors about the Voynich manuscript, this bizarre, undecipherable book filled with strange plants and cryptic symbols? Has been called everything from an alien encyclopedia to a suppressed herbal remedy guide. Some insist the Church locked it away because it revealed forbidden healing techniques. Yet carbon dating places its creation in the early 15th century, long after the peak of medieval book burnings. More likely, it's just an eccentric private project, its meaning lost to time rather than malice. What's revealing about these myths is how they mirror the anxieties of their eras. The Emerald Tablet legend thrives in New Age circles hungry for hidden spirituality. The Cathar treasure speaks to modern fascination with religious cover-ups. The Voynich obsession reflects our love of unsolved puzzles. But while speculation can be fun, it sometimes obscures the real tragedy. We don't need conspiracies to explain why knowledge disappears. Power silences dissent not with shadowy plots, but with brute force and bureaucratic efficiency. The Church didn't burn books because they held magical secrets, they burned them because they challenged a worldview. That's not to say all mysteries are fabrications. Some gaps in history do hint at deliberate erasure. Consider the fate of Hypatia's writings. This brilliant philosopher and mathematician of Alexandria was murdered by a Christian mob in 415, and her works were likely destroyed soon after. We know she existed because contemporaries praised her genius, but not a single line of her own words survives. Here, the loss feels intentional, a way to sever her influence. Yet even this wasn't a conspiracy so much as a blunt instrument of orthodoxy. So how do we separate fact from folklore? Start by asking who benefits from the myth. Romantic tales of hidden gospels or alchemical secrets often say more about our desires than history's realities. The truth is, most banned books weren't mystical, they were just inconvenient. The real conspiracy isn't a secret cabal guarding ancient truths. It's the mundane, relentless machinery of censorship that still operates today, just in new forms. Because when we imagine lost knowledge as something fantastical, we risk overlooking the ordinary, systemic ways ideas are still suppressed, not with bonfires, but with algorithms, laws, and silence. Perhaps the most enduring myth of all is that the past's battles over knowledge are behind us. They're not. They've just changed costumes, and that's a truth far more unsettling than any coded manuscript. But history never truly repeats itself, it just reinvents its methods. If we look closely at the lessons of medieval book burnings, we'll see their echoes in today's battles over knowledge. The tools might have changed, but the stakes remain just as high. Think about how easily information vanishes now. A social media post disappears with one click. An algorithm buries controversial research. governments quietly rewrite digital archives. It's not flames in a town square anymore, but the effect is eerily similar. Certain ideas get erased because they challenge those in power. Take the silencing of scientists during the early days of the COVID pandemic, or the way authoritarian regimes manipulate search results to control narratives. The mechanisms are sleek and digital, but the intent mirrors medieval bishops tossing manuscripts into bonfires. Yet there's a crucial difference. In the Middle Ages, destroying a book meant obliterating it completely. Today, censorship often leaves digital breadcrumbs. Deleted content resurfaces on mirror sites. Suppressed reports leak through whistleblowers. That's why modern censorship isn't just about deletion. It's about drowning out. The real danger now is noise flooding the public sphere with so much misinformation and distraction that the truth becomes impossible to find. It's not the fire that destroys knowledge anymore, it's the fog. This makes preservation more vital than ever. Medieval monks risked their lives hiding banned texts in cellars or encoding heresies in harmless-looking manuscripts. Today, archivists and hackers do the same, backing up endangered data on decentralized servers or etching digital libraries into blockchain ledgers. Projects like the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine or the censorship-resistant Urbit network are our modern equivalents of those hidden monastic libraries, silent guardians against digital dark ages. But preservation alone isn't enough. What doomed the lost works of Hypatia or the Cathars wasn't just their physical destruction. It was the way their absence reshaped entire generations' understanding of what knowledge mattered. When only one worldview survives, people forget alternatives ever existed. That's why the fight isn't just about saving books, it's about fighting cultural amnesia. Every time a school board bans a book on race or gender, or a government restricts access to foreign news sources, they're not just hiding information. They're shrinking the collective imagination. Here's where history offers hope. For every text the medieval church burned, others survived, sometimes by accident, sometimes through sheer stubbornness. A parchment reused as a wine stopper, a crumbling codex traded under cloaks in Venice. Their survival reminds us that censorship is never fully victorious. Knowledge has a way of seeping through cracks. Today, banned books reappear as PDFs in encrypted chats. Suppressed lectures turn into viral videos. The methods evolve, but human curiosity remains unconquerable. So what's our role in this? First, vigilance. Notice what gets removed from your feeds, which voices suddenly go quiet. Second, participation. Support libraries, digital archives, and independent publishers, the monasteries of our age. Most importantly, pass on what you learn. The greatest antidote to censorship has always been ordinary people refusing to forget. Because here's the uncomfortable truth the medieval burnings teach us: no society is immune to the impulse to control knowledge. Not then, not now, but neither are we powerless. Every time you share a banned book, archive a threatened website, or simply question why certain stories disappear, you're adding a stitch to the safety net that keeps truth from falling into silence. And that's where this story doesn't end. It becomes yours, because history isn't just about what was lost, it's about what we choose to save. Now, let's take a step back and consider the full weight of what was lost. The books burned by the church weren't just parchment and ink, they were fragments of entire worldviews, alternative paths for human thought that vanished in smoke. Imagine a world where Hypatia's mathematical discoveries weren't erased, where the Gnostic Gospels sat alongside the New Testament, where indigenous European spirituality evolved alongside Christianity. The intellectual landscape of the West might look radically different today. This isn't just about historical curiosity. These losses shaped the very foundations of our modern world. When the church systematically destroyed texts that challenged its doctrine, it didn't just silence dissent, it narrowed the boundaries of what could be thought, studied, or even imagined for centuries. The suppression of early scientific works, for example, may have delayed medical advances by generations. the eradication of pagan philosophies left us with fewer tools to understand humanity's place in nature. Even the poetic traditions lost to censorship robbed future generations of beauty and cultural memory. There's a deeper lesson here about who gets to write history. For centuries, we've accepted the medieval church's version of events as definitive. The Dark Ages were dark, the heretics were dangerous, the burnings were necessary. But what if that narrative itself is incomplete? The victors don't just write history, they decide what counts as history in the first place. Every banned book, every burned library represents a missing piece of that puzzle, a voice excluded from the conversation. Yet even in this stark reality, there's reason for hope. The fragments that survived, whether by chance or cunning, remind us that truth is stubborn. A single crumbling manuscript rediscovered in an Egyptian cave can append centuries of assumed knowledge, as the Nag Hammadi texts did for early Christianity. A forgotten herbal remedy preserved in oral tradition might hold cures modern medicine has overlooked. These survivals hint at the vastness of what we still don't know and what might yet be recovered. So what can we take from all this? First, humility. Recognize that much of what we consider established knowledge is just the version that outlasted its alternatives. Second, curiosity. Seek out the surviving fragments, the marginalized voices, the inconvenient histories. They often contain the most vital corrections to our understanding. And finally, responsibility. In an age where digital information can vanish as swiftly as medieval parchments once did, we must become the archivists of our era. Whether it's saving a controversial article to your hard drive, supporting independent scholars, or simply questioning why certain stories get buried, these small acts matter. The story of the burned books isn't just about the past. It's a mirror reflecting our own choices about what knowledge we value, preserve, and pass on. Every generation faces its own version of the bonfire. The question is whether we'll be the ones lighting it or the ones carrying the torch forward. If this journey through lost knowledge resonated with you, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button to join a community committed to uncovering history's hidden chapters. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into forgotten truths. And most importantly, keep questioning, keep searching, because history isn't just what's written in textbooks. It's what survives against all odds, waiting to be rediscovered by those willing to look.